I would like to welcome the presenter of the panel that we are participating in just now. His name is Juris Pupcenoks. And his talk is entitled Democratic Islamization in Pakistan and Turkey, Lessons for the Post-Arab Spring Middle East. He is the Assistant Professor, Marist College, New York. He's a visiting professor at Washington College, Maryland, doctoral and dissertation fellow at the Center for Teaching and Learning, University of Delaware. His fields of study are international relations and comparative politics. And without further ado, let me welcome him to the podium.
Thank you very much. Okay, so my talk today is about democratic Islamization in Pakistan and Turkey, and what does that tell us about how the future of the Middle East might look like. So I'm planning to go for about 10 to 15 minutes and then take questions, and we have till 10:30. Yeah. All right, so what I wanted to do is I wanted to introduce two models of democratic Islamization. And then see what of that is most likely to happen in the post-Arab Spring Middle East, where we, as we've seen, Islamic parties are increasingly gaining power, they're increasingly being elected, and so on. So I started my research with this question: how does an Islamic democracy look like, and what kind of Islamic reforms will parties who are elected, Islamic parties who are elected, will undertake? Because in the West, nobody really knows how mature Islamic democracy looks like. When people in the West look at Islamic governance, sometimes they look at examples of Islamists ruling in authoritarian settings, such as Zia al-Haq in Pakistan in 1980s, and his reforms, Islamizing reforms, were largely associated with hudud laws, trying to outlaw interest, and so on. In the West, there's really not that many instances of Islamic parties coming to power and then being able to implement their agenda. And the Western countries are wondering, and also people in the Middle East themselves and in the Muslim world are questioning how exactly Islamic democracy look like. So what I want to do is I don't want to question this. I want to look at examples of Islamic parties coming to power in two Pakistani provinces. So from 2002 to 2008, two Pakistani provinces were governed by Islamic Coalition, MMA. And I want to look at the national government in Turkey from 2002 to now, and then specifically see what kind of Islamic reforms they've done and how does this Islamic democracy look like. So what do we see? What do we see in two places? We see that in both instances, Islamic parties, when they're finally elected in 2002, which is more or less anomaly, because Islamic parties, maybe with the exception of Iran, or really there's not much examples of Islamist governance. So in both instances, they were elected largely due to the fact that alternatives were seen to be corrupt, and so on. Once they came to power, I shall argue that we can develop a model of democratic Islamization by focusing on policies in education, economy, and social policies. So I think that's the best way, in my opinion, to understand how does Islamic democracy and democratic Islamization look like. You look at the reforms and laws passed and initiatives undertaken in education, economy, and social policy. And I think that allows us to move beyond saying Islamization and talking about this vague thing and looking at something more specific. So what do we see in these two countries? In Pakistan, MMA come to power in 2002 when it wins elections in two provinces. And back then they were largely elected because of widespread corruption, anti-American sentiment. They were able to build coalition, and really no Islamic party or coalition since then have had such a big support in Pakistani elections. And then once they were elected, a lot of people in the West questioned, how will they govern? What will they do? And what we've seen is a lot of moderation. We see a lot of internal divisions within this party itself. We see a lot of conflicts with the national government, with President Musharraf at the time, with the national court, with the Supreme Court, who is trying to basically oppose a lot of Islamic initiatives that they're undertaking. So once we look at Pakistan, and I call Pakistani model conflicted repressive Islamization, That's the catchy term I came up with. Once we look at their reforms in education, what do we see? We see that, well, as expected, they promoted reforms aimed at gender segregation, promoting religious education. But also, which comes surprisingly to a lot of people, MMA in Pakistan, they also encourage establishment of more girls' schools and also encouraged education of girls. Then we look at economy, where a lot of people at the West were concerned. They think, no, when Islamists are in power, they're going to outlaw interests, riba, they promote Islamic banking, and that will counter the capitalism, which is fearful to a lot of people in the West. But what we see is that really, by and large, these major initiatives taken in economy by MMA, this Islamist alliance, were not really undermining capitalism. Yes, they regulated entertainment. They were pushing for a lot of anti-obscenity laws, regulating music, advertising. They tried to outlaw use of female body in advertisement altogether. That wasn't successful. But by and large, they did not try to push for something like outlawing of interest, riba, and so on. And then in social policy, what do we see they're doing? They're encouraging mandatory prayers, veils, gender segregation again. Unsuccessfully, they tried to establish like a virtue council. But overall, once we see these reforms, there is evidence to say that overall reform and their impact of women has been fairly modest. Fairly modest. All right, now let's look at the AKP. AKP in Turkey came in power in 2002. It's a successor of Islamic parties who have been there before them. They're like more moderate version of these parties. And once they were elected, how did they behave in the electoral system? And again, we see that they're being contested by the army, by the Supreme Court, also the secular establishment of Turkey. And we see that they have been able to implement most of their promises. So how does Turkish Islamization look like, or what I call Turkish subtle Islamization? It's much more subtle and it's less conflicted than in Pakistan's case. In education, we see that Turkish Islamist Party, they empower religious graduates. They appoint a lot of Islamists to powers of position in educational bureaucracy. They try to rewrite textbooks and promote rewriting of textbooks, including more Islamic terms in their textbooks. Once we look at economy, yes, they did promote Islamic economy and Islamic initiatives. They try to regulate entertainment as well, limit alcohol and so on. But at the same time, Turkey is also undergoing really big economic growth, which coincides with AKP governance. Whether it's cause or consequence, correlation is not causation, we know that, but still, by and large, they're friendly to capitalism, and they've actually taken more steps towards bringing Turkey closer to the EU membership than any government in the past, I would say. And if you look at their social policies, that initially AKP tried to promote strict laws criminalizing adultery, but soon, due to the pressure, they tabled them. They were trying to fight headscarf ban. They promote Islamic initiatives, but their promotion is more subtle, and they really aim at removing obstacles that would allow people to practice their faith publicly. So they try to challenge the public. They try to challenge the headscarf law, ban law. So the wives of key AKP officials sometimes attend events in public covered. So their support is more like subtle, and they try to remove obstacles as opposed to mandating certain Islamic practices. So if I compare these two real quick, very different kind of models of Islamization, what we see in Pakistan and Turkey, what do we see? I'll skip over differences, so we have time for discussion, but I'll focus on the commonalities. I would say if you look at Islamic democratization, democratic Islamization, that would be a better term. We see, what does it mean in education? It means empowering Islamic schools, empowering Islamic school graduates, and making sure that their degrees are more or less equated with non-religious school graduates. Promotion of Islamic curriculum and appointing of a lot of Islamists to government in the bureaucracies. We see that. And I think that's how Islamic governance will look like also in countries in the Middle East now, where Islamic parties will be elected. If you look at economy, we see that there are likely to be a lot of reforms to restricting entertainment, alcohol. But again, by and large, these reforms are not that antagonistic or hostile to capitalism. Even in Turkey, where AKP have taken some measures to make alcohol more expensive and to ban it in certain places, as some secular Turks have pointed out, there's no shortage of nightclubs or places you can go. And in both of these countries where Islamists were in power, and while they were in power, they were not trying to ban interest and things like that. And then finally, in the social policies, I think these two models have quite different things to say. In Pakistani case, which I would say is more like conflicted and repressive, you have specific laws passed promoting gender segregation and also to mandate certain things to be done. They tried to establish virtue council, which they were not successful, but then the purpose of virtue council will be to investigate and potentially punish certain people who do things which are deemed to be un-Islamic. Well, in Turkish case, in this Turkish subtle Islamization, what we see, they try to remove obstacles, which then would allow people to practice their faith publicly, right? So they don't necessarily try to pass laws that try to mandate doing certain things publicly that would be, based on Islamic beliefs or so on, but they try to challenge the headscarf ban, which would then enable girls and females to attend college with their headscarf on. And they recently have been more successful with that, finally. And they backed off of some of the most controversial laws, such as laws criminalizing adultery and so on. And the final point I want to make, so the overall picture is this: Islamic parties in government, they tend to moderate, they tend to be pragmatic political players. And Islamic democracy can exist, obviously. And finally, though, one caveat is this, that in both cases, this moderation, I think, to a large extent was due to the pressure exerted on these parties in power due to the other power centers in societies. In Pakistani case, a lot of pressure on the MMA alliance was put on by the Musharraf government, which was against these Islamic initiatives, by the Supreme Court, which was struck down some of the Islamic laws, more Islamic and restrictive laws passed by MMA. In Turkey, as we see AKP in governance, and also they've been facing a lot of opposition from the secular establishment, which is very rooted in Turkish society, and from the Supreme Court, and so on. So I think also a lot of this moderation might be due to other power centers in these two societies, but also it's true that a lot of these Islamic reforms that were feared in the West, such as institutionalization of outlawing of interest, or oppressing women or something like that, did not necessarily happen. So, and with this, I wanted to end and turn it to the questions.
Thank you so much. May I take the liberty of asking the first question? I happen to be a Pakistani American myself, and I just wanted to bring a couple of things here to the fore. One of them is that the Islamization of Pakistan happened because in the two provinces which feel the most put upon by the Punjabi ruling majority of the country. And the second point that I want to make is that there are political and cultural forces at play much more that contribute to this Islamization process. But ultimately, I think that the majority, which is more secular than not, is likely to rule. And so with that, I open the floor up now for questions.
Very true. Well,
please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Yusuf. I'm not trying to question your methodology, but just I wonder how you would account in your argument for the revolutionary factor. I mean, the two cases that you're referring to in Pakistan and Turkey, the Islamist parties came to power by elections, but this was not within a revolutionary process. I would just wonder whether you can compare this to Iran. I understand this is different, but there is also a country where Islamist parties came into power, or at least formed a substantial component of the government after the revolution, which is Indonesia. So I just wonder whether how do you deal with that, especially that in revolutionary processes, I mean, unlike the Turkey or Pakistan, the Islamist parties would have the perception or the belief that they have already defeated the establishment. In Turkey and Pakistan, it could be the case that they have been moderating their positions simply because the establishment is still there and they had to negotiate something of a deal.
Yes, that's an excellent question. So how do I account for this revolutionary factor? I will have to work this into this paper somehow, because I finished that paper before the Arab Spring, and that was before all of these uprisings. So I didn't initially factor it in the initial paper. So I think, one thing hopefully I hope could be taken away from my paper is just this one particular maybe model of democratic Islamization and maybe some of the things that Islamist parties in power might do. But you're right that dynamics are different in the post-Arab Spring Middle East, where there is this uprising factor. And I think that might... I'll have to think about that. Yeah?
My name is Wissam Yafi. It's very interesting, your talk. But I think there's a couple of basic assumptions there that you may want to consider. One is that, throughout the history of Islam, even going back to the Umayyads, you're talking right after the caliphs, the first four at least, really Islamization has not controlled any part of the, just Islamic parties per se. There's been secular presence in almost the entire history. So I think that primary assumption that one can control, or Islam can control a system as an experiment in and of itself, it's been rare, and it hasn't actually within the entire Arab world or a lot of the Islamic world, I don't think it's been that clear cut. So that's almost an experiment for the Islamic world itself. So that's the basic assumption that the Islamists could take over, when in reality throughout its history the Islamists have almost never taken over. Even going back to the days you're talking the Umayyads, that's one. The other point that I wanted to bring up is there are, you look at it from the point of view of, I guess, Islam taking over, but I think you also may want to look at Islam's coexisting within democratic systems, such as the case of India, such as the case of, for example, Lebanon, such as the case of Europe. In certain cases, you've got, in France, for example, 6 million Muslims living. I mean, that's a huge portion of the population. In Lebanon, the experiment with Hezbollah, regardless of the Iran factor, coexisting within a democratic, quasi-democratic system, is something that, for the Lebanese at least, has been quite an interesting experiment, because there hasn't been a coup d'etat of sorts in any of that period, or an imposition. In fact, there's been more of a practicalization of Islamic ideology within the setting of a democracy. So that's kind of the Lebanon experiment within the overall Arab world, and that's pre-uprising. So you're talking the democratic experiment, or the Islam within a democratic experiment, has started since the 1990s. And India, of course, is another, which I think between India and Indonesia, those are the largest, I guess, non-Arab Islamic populations that have coexisted within a democracy. And also you haven't seen that pure Islamization or control by mullahs, which is really the Iran experiment that's in and of itself kind of an anomaly throughout the history. So I just wanted to bring those points up, but I thought your discussion and your paper are excellent. Thank you.
And that's a great point. This sounds like a great book project.
Yes, there's another question.
Yeah, so going back to the Islamic experiment in 2 provinces in Pakistan, one of the reasons that happened was also the fact that the military dictator had very deliberately excluded mainstream political parties, and had very deliberately, through a variety of mechanisms, empowered the religious coalitions. And so when it's about sort of like coming through elections, that was also sort of, the participation in the election is always up for debate, I think, in Pakistan. So those were a couple of factors that I thought should also, be counted into when we're talking about the Islamic experiment in Pakistan. But one of the crucial differences that I could see between Pakistan and Turkey was the fact that the AKP in Turkey has evolved so much over time. It started off as something much more much more rigid, I would say. And then over the years, it's moderated its position and become somewhat of a more mature form of an Islamic party, if you can call it that. But in Pakistan, it was the first time that the Islamic parties had come into power. And so clearly they were not very mature, to say the least. So, I mean, time, I think, also factors into how mature an Islamic democracy can be.
And I'll make one final point, which is that if the Afghan war wasn't going on between the two superpowers, then Ziaul Haq may never have lasted for those 9 years that he did last, and none of this might have happened. And so that is one point that we cannot ignore in this whole equation. Any other questions? Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, my name is Carl Weichel, and my question is what do you see as the possibility of Turkey actually joining the European Union? I was there a few years ago, and within Turkey, at that point in time, the feeling was, well, maybe we don't really want to join because we'd lose our identity and all these disadvantages concurrently going to Germany afterwards. There was a tacit feeling that maybe if the clock ran out, maybe they might not actually join. So there is that point, and within Turkey, are two different groups pushing more pro-Western permanent joining, or is this at a juncture point where there may be some clock running out and not being allowed to join?
Yeah, and I think this debate going to continue, and I do think it will largely depend how successful Europeans will resolve their current crises. If they'll be able to resolve their economic crises and economy will again return and have sustainable good growth, I think Turkey will eventually join.
Is the requirement of eliminating the death penalty still a requisite to join the European Union? Is that it?
As far as I know, yes.
So then the country would be willing to make that significant step forward?
Well, eventually, I do think so. But again, this is just my opinion.